This is a modification and upgrade guide to the popular 1.9 TDi from the Volkswagen Group. That includes Audi, Seat and Skoda. They've all used iterations of this engine in various models. And I'm going to go quite in depth into all of the mods and upgrades, but most people watching this video will just be looking for a simple route to get a little more power. And that's something that we will cover. But a lot of you will also want more in-depth information. We've had fantastic feedback from you, from our members. Things have moved on in the tuning world, and there's a few points that I've missed out that I really want to include in this video. You've got a Volkswagen Group 1.9 TDi engine and you're looking to put that little bit more power in it. You've got a really good engine. The 1.9 TDi is still regarded as one of the most reliable and trustworthy engines that the Volkswagen Group have produced over the years. Even better than the later 2-litre TDi which replaced it, which has been dogged by many different niggles and problems, most of which have now been ironed out. But we've got other videos dealing with the 2-litre TDIs. We're going to talk about two versions of the 1.9 TDi. There's the pre-Pump Duse version, and then there's the one that had the Pump Duse injection system added, which offers greater flexibility and more tuning potential. We're going to talk about the best and most significant upgrades for your 1.9 TDi. Most of the 1.9 TDi units had Bosch injectors and a Bosch ECU, so that's good tried and tested technology that works really well. And the Bosch ECUs are very protective over the engines. It's hard for things to go wrong electronically within the engine without the ECU cutting in and forcing a limp home mode. You can do a lot to these engines to increase the power. But what's the most significant thing you can do? Well, it has to be a remap. If your car was made after the year 2000, it's quite easily mappable via the OBD2 port. The cars before 2000 really require a bench flash, and there's a little bit more work involved in getting a map to take on the ECU. So power figures from the engine range from about 90 horsepower to about 150 horsepower from the factory, and remapping these all see pretty good gains. The TDi 90 can map to about 116 PS. Just taking a mid-range power figure, the TDi 110, that'll map to about 143 PS, and the PD 140 and 150 will see you hit around about 170, 180 PS when it's being mapped. So there's a lot of potential just within the standard engines, and it shows just how strong these blocks are. And people that have had maps done on these cars generally report better fuel economy as well as all that extra power. So be very careful with your map. You don't want to go too aggressive. You certainly don't want to make it sooty and smoky. On the 1.9 TDi, if you want more power than you would get with just a map, you have to look at changing out the turbo unit, and there's a few different options and upgrades available. Obviously the lower powered engines tend to have a smaller turbo and more limited fuel injection systems. If you've got the lower powered 1.9 TDi, you need to address the fuel system, uprating to the 140, the 150 version of the engine's fuel system. Uprating it to the 140, 150 engine version of the injectors and the fuel pump will give you a lot more headroom. But there's also other upgrades that you can apply to the car to lift the fuel supply further. The injectors on the PD 130, the 140 and the 150 are generally good for around 240 horsepower before you need to replace them, before they start topping out. The smaller engines will certainly need beefier injectors and a beefier fuel system to tolerate anywhere approaching those power figures. Getting full race injectors is not the only option. You can change the nozzles in the standard injectors, which can be a more cost-effective upgrade and good for the slightly mid to lower power builds. The Ferrad 80% nozzles have often been swapped into the PD 130s and 150 injector nozzles just to give you that little bit better fuel atomization and achieve better power figures and smoother fuel delivery. There's quite a few decent turbo upgrades around. We'll just flag up some of the most popular ones that our members have fitted to the 1.9 TDi. There's obviously other units out there, but these ones we know work, and they generally come in a kit with all the supporting parts, and a lot of thought has gone into the design of these turbos. You've got the GTD 2872 VRK, which can see power figures of around 375 to 400, so that's more than ample on a 1.9 TDi engine. Then you've got the GTB 2260 VK, which tops out at around 350 horsepower, and that'll give you 35 PS psi of boost at about 2,800 RPM, which is a nice spot in the RPM range to have that amount of boost. We've also got the GTB 2056 VK, which is a very popular unit. That will generally flow well to about 300 horsepower, and that'll give you about 34 psi at 2,750 RPM. So it's a slightly lower peak power point in the RPM range, making that turbo ideal for everyday driving and for towing, for caravans, that sort of thing. That's where you want the power slightly lower down in the RPM range. Then we've got the GTB 1756 VK, which tops out at around 250. So the power seems a lot down on the other turbos, but looking at the point it delivers the power, this happens at 2,650 RPM, and you get about 34 psi of boost. Although the turbo's headline power figure is much lower than the others, it's probably the best choice for most drivers that are just seeking more flexibility in the power delivery, and they want that low end fast spool up that you would get. If you're prepared to do a little bit more work on your 1.9 TDI to just fit a different turbo, this would involve changing the pipework and a lot of the other ancillary components that drive the turbo and supply the air to the engine. You've got the GTB 1749V, which produces up to 205 horsepower at just 1,900 RPM. There's also the GTB 1756V, which is good for around 225 horsepower. And there's lots of other hybrid turbos around that use components from these popular turbos, and they'll deliver a fairly flexible 240 horsepower pretty much across the rev range. So work out where in the rev range you want your power on your 1.9 TDI engine and choose a turbo that can suit that. Once you've had the turbo fitted, make sure it is carefully mapped and that the fueling is sufficient to supply enough fuel to match the air that's going into the engine, and you'll have a really sparkling performing 1.9 TDI. The turbos will often require conversion to vacuum actuators, and the VNT system needs to be set up correctly. There's a little bit of an art in setting that up properly, but once you've got it spot on, you really are there in the sweet spot of power delivery. While we're talking about turbos, I need to mention the turbo blanket as well. What this does effectively is traps all of the exhaust heat inside the turbo, keeps it away from the intake side of the engine and also the engine bay, reducing those temperatures, because temperature is going to rob you of power. And the more power you're putting through, the more heat you're going to deal with. So the turbo blanket is a very sensible option and a relatively inexpensive, cheap upgrade. I've talked about hybrid turbos, but it's worth noting they're not all equal. The quality that you get with hybrid turbos varies considerably. It's worth speaking to someone that actually knows what they're doing when it comes to these turbos. The typical issues you're going to get is inconsistent power delivery. It's going to be really hard to map because maybe all the power spools on at a weird point in the RPM range and it's not consistent, and the person doing the map then has to compensate for the bad hardware and can't really focus on extracting the most performance for your engine. They've got these other concerns and often need to make compromises to keep everything running smoothly for you. A well-built 1752 hybrid, for example, will quite happily deliver power in the 220 to 230 horsepower region on stock fuel injectors, obviously with the correct map behind it. If you've increased power by about 50 horsepower, it's strongly recommended that you get a hard pipe kit which can contain that boost more easily, and you reduce the risk of having some kind of boost leak somewhere in the system. The 1.9 TDI turbos were essentially the same, but there are differences in the downpipe design and the manifolds that attach them to the engine and some of the other components, particularly if the engine was transversely mounted or it was an inline engine. Don't get caught out. You might think you're buying a 1.9 TDI turbo, but there were still some differences depending on the applications. Check that it will fit your specific model of car before you buy a kit and commit to it. It's also worth looking at the intercooler. The factory spec intercoolers on the 1.9 TDIs in most cars are somewhat lacking. You can go a long way to improve the intercooler. Now bear in mind that changing the intercooler doesn't add power, but it allows you to get your power delivered for longer periods of time. So as the intercooler warms up, it stops becoming as effective at cooling that charge of air that's going into the engine, and that's really where you start losing power. So if you do lots of spirited driving or you're frequently exploring the upper thirds of your RPM range, and let's face it, most of our viewers and most of our website visitors do that, you really need to uprate the intercooler. So fitting a larger front mounted intercooler is usually the solution and it might in some cars require a little bit of modification to the front bumper, but that would just make sure that you're not losing power unnecessarily with a very restricted intercooler that's warming up too quickly. Intake and exhaust upgrades on the 1.9 TDI, do we recommend them? Well, from a pure power point of view, we don't. The 1.9 TDI engine has a very good exhaust system and intake system in most applications. There's probably a few exceptions out there, but generally speaking, the Volkswagen Audi group have done a good job at supplying more than enough air to the engine and carrying the exhaust gases away from the engine when it's finished its burn cycle. So adding an induction kit or a sports exhaust won't really increase power at all. You won't notice a difference because the stock setup is quite good. Even when you've tuned it, you'll find that the stock system can actually cope pretty well with those upgrades. While we're talking about intake, we also need to talk about the intake manifold. These are getting quite old now. A lot of the 1.9 TDIs are about 15 years old or older, and the mileage is also racking up. When you take these off, you will typically see quite a bit of carbon building up in them. It's a really good idea to just remove the intake, thoroughly clean it, or better still, replace it, get a new one, because that's going to rob you of some of the power of your build. It doesn't cost a lot to do that, but the gains you get outweigh any investment in taking the manifold off and cleaning it, or even replacing the manifold. And if you're ever working on an older engine, check the pipes around the intercooler, the intake, after the turbo. They're obviously running pressurized air into the engine, and if you've got any leaks, you're going to lose boost, and that's going to cause problems and be quite hard to diagnose. And we've seen the pipes pop off the intercooler from time to time at high boost figures, and that results in a catastrophic loss of power and a very scary bang. It happened to me once, and it took quite a while to diagnose and find the problem, but we got there in the end, and thankfully it was just a pipe that had become detached. Replacing the pipe was better than just trying to fix it on with better clips. They do tend to wear and split, particularly if you've been moving them around. Now, most cars fitted with the 1.9 TDI are front wheel drive, and that really means you were guaranteed traction problems at 220 horsepower or more. The greater the figure over 220, the bigger the traction issues. If you are thinking of a big power build, you do need to think about getting that power down. So choosing a differential, choosing tyres that can actually handle it, getting the suspension set up properly as well. They can all go a long way to mitigate the issues that you're going to face, or converting it to four-wheel drive if you want a more complex project but you want to fully utilise all of the power. Let's look at some real-world figures from projects that we've either seen on the internet or members have had done to their cars, and various dyno printouts that we've had access to. A PD130 running the GTB 2260 turbo kit with a race camshaft, the Farad 80% nozzles and a custom remap would comfortably put down just shy of 270 horsepower, 265 to 267 generally we see. Torque though, it's 380 to 390 pounds-foot of torque. That is earth twisting levels of torque. Phenomenal for just a 1.9 diesel engine. The power curve is particularly interesting on the 2260. There's a noticeable lag to about 2,600 RPM, but after that, power delivery is really smooth all the way up to the red line, which is typically about 4,900 RPM. The 1752, the budget option for smaller builds, which will typically be run with stock injectors and a front mounted intercooler, hard pipe kit and uprated head bolts, will typically produce about 230 horsepower and 350 pounds-foot of torque. That nets you an extra 60 horsepower over a standard mapped PD130, and it's up to you to consider whether those extra parts is worth the investment to get that extra power, but it certainly transforms the car and makes it an interesting beast to drive on the road, and particularly to take on the track. So I would recommend though that in some of the engines you get the port size enlarged and just make sure that the head is flowing correctly, because that can be a little bit of a bottleneck in some of the 1.9 TDI engines that might be sapping some of the power for those projects where you're trying to extract every extra horsepower that you can. But for most people that's just an unnecessary expense, and the gains that you see will be negligible. When I added a panel air filter to my TDI engine, I didn't notice any more power, but I did notice that when you lift lifted off the throttle, the engine kept its speed for longer. It didn't seem to bog down as quickly. And subtly, I think that probably helped my fuel economy a little bit. So I fitted a K&N cotton gauze panel air filter. They've not paid me to say this. That's just one that I've bought myself, I've used, and it seemed to be quite effective. But bear in mind that aftermarket air filters and performance filters will not filter as effectively as the OEM paper filter. So there's a little bit of a sacrifice there. You're getting a little more crud and gunk into the engine. So changing the oil more regularly makes a lot of sense, especially on a tuned 1.9 TDI. You want that oil to cope with the extreme operating conditions that you're putting it through now. With the exhaust, it seems when you put these on the dyno, in most cars, the stock exhaust can cope well to about 240 horsepower. Then you start seeing a little bit of a reduction in power from an aftermarket exhaust. Typical problem areas in these is the headers and the DPF filters and the catalysts if you've got them fitted to your killer model of 1.9 TDI. I had a few people commenting that the 1.9 TDI never came with the DPF, the diesel particulate filter, but actually it did. There were a few models, it may be region specific as well, but some of these did actually come with the diesel particulate filter. Now, whether you remove the diesel particulate filter or the EGR system, it's a matter really down to legality. Most of the comments that people leave on these videos is to do a delete straight away and get rid of these items. But in some regions, it's just not legal to do so, and you could potentially face fines or other legal issues if you went that route. I'd encourage you to do your research before making a final decision as to whether you should go the delete route or just optimize what you've got as best you can. Fitting a higher flowing sports alternative can make a big difference. If it's legal in your area to swap these devices for a sports alternative, it makes a lot of sense to do so. But again, I would probably only do that if I was actually needing to replace an exhaust system. I wouldn't go out of my way to just do it for the sake of it. If you do any work inside the engine, don't reuse the head bolts. I shouldn't have to say that, but some people cut that corner and they've used these head bolts that have stretched and they very quickly break and fail. If you are looking for an upgraded set of head bolts, you can potentially get some from within the Volkswagen engine component range, because some of the engines had uprated and tougher head bolts than other models. And if you're just doing modifications inside the engine, it makes sense to at least go for these slightly improved, uprated, stronger bolts. A note on the head bolts, the 1.9 TDI 130s came with 10.9 tensile head bolts. The PD 150 came at 12.9 tensile, which is why switching to those is a good idea on those lower powered engines where you're hitting slightly higher power figures. But that's only good to around 230 horsepower. If you're going beyond that, you need to start thinking about head studs instead of bolts. Head lift can be a problem with these really big high power builds. Let me know your thoughts on that in the comment section as well. If you experience head lift or you're quite happy pushing the power to ridiculous power levels on standard head bolts. We need to also mention raised camshafts. This is something you might want to consider on the higher powered builds. If you're really pushing the extreme, a fast road camshaft will change the profile of the air coming into the engine, allowing better tuning of the valve lift, the duration and the timing, and is something you should certainly consider at 230 to 250 horsepower or more to make sure that you're able to extract the full amount of power from your build. The clutch is also a common problem area on the 1.9 TDI. As they get older, they start to slip a little bit, and when you've remapped it and you've increased the power significantly, that's often enough to push an old worn clutch over the edge so it can no longer cope. So it makes a lot of sense to just uprate the clutch with a slightly firmer version. Last time I did this video, a lot of people commented on the dual mass flywheel versus single mass flywheel debate. And my traditional recommendation has always been to stick with a dual mass flywheel, but quite a few of you have quite rightly expressed your opinion that that's wrong, that you are quite happy having a single mass flywheel, a slightly lighter flywheel, and you note that that's improved the characteristics of the engine. It revs more freely and there's not undue vibration. I have had a few people that contradict that, so it may just be down to specific models or maybe even the age of the car, but certainly do your research before you make that ultimate decision as to whether you should convert your dual mass flywheel into a single. Tell me in the comments about your build, your power figures, what you're planning to do to your 1.9 TDI. The There are some really interesting projects out there, and people are really loving these simpler, older, reliable engines compared to some of the more complex modern ones with all their particulate filters and electronic sensors and various systems. Just to summarise what we've said here, the remap is the most significant power gain you can get. If you want more power on your 1.9 TDI, you need to look at the turbo, and on the smaller engine versions, you certainly need to increase the fuel delivery, the fuel system, the injectors and the fuel pump. If you want more power out of it, it requires a little bit more work looking at the flow rate into the engine. So we hope this has given you a really good overview of 1.9 TDI tuning. We've got lots of in-depth articles on our site that go into much more detail on the 1.9 engines, the very different flavours of engine that have come out with each successive generation. So if you want more information, please visit our site. There's links at the bottom. Stay tuned. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe. We'd love you to keep up to date with all the content that we're putting out. Please let me know in the comments what car you've got, which 1.9 TDI engine you have as well, because that'll help me to shape future content. I really want to cover the stuff that you are interested in and that you want to hear about. And please throw us up a like, because that really helps us to get out there. Thanks for watching. And I've lined up this video and this playlist that you should find really interesting. Thanks for watching. See you in these next videos.